We have a way too early bracketology update from Joe Lunardi. So let's break it down and see where the Tigers land. Welcome into the Barn Hoops podcast. I am your host, Jacob Hillman, and now we are getting into the preseason hype portion of this offseason. And like I said, way too early bracketology updates from Joe Lunardi, where Auburn lands in a familiar position, and it's as a top 4 seed in the NCAA tournament. And really, this is more the same of last year. It follows a lot of the same paths as there are plenty of SEC teams involved in this bracket update from Lunardi of ESPN.com. And quite frankly, I think this is about where you would expect Auburn to be landed. This team, obviously, being a brand new team, the lone returnee being Tahaad Pettiford, the sophomore point guard from Jersey City, New Jersey, and then just a whole bunch of newcomers between freshmen, JUCO, and D2 transfers, as well as your high major transfers. This team is going to be brand new and is getting to work in the practice gym and in the weight room as they prepare for the upcoming season. We've also got some exhibition news updates to bring to you and talk about here in just a few moments. But again, sign up now for a $25 annual subscription to The Barn at thebarnauburn.com. Plenty of content there, as well as you need to be subscribed and like right here on YouTube and wherever you find your podcast for all of the content we push out, whether it's the Barn Hoops podcast with myself or Village Vibes with Brad Law and Zach Blackerby, or the Top Button podcast with Charlie Five or Kyle Rush. So looking at this bracket from Joe Lunardi and where things lay out specifically for Auburn, the Tigers are in the South region again, just like last year when they were the number 1 overall seed in the NCAA tournament. That was in Atlanta. This South regional will be in Houston. And there's some interesting news with that, but we'll get to that in just a moment. But Auburn would be the 4th seed headed to Tampa, and in their pod would be 5th seeded Louisville, and the Tigers would face off with High Point, who is the 13th seed. Louisville will be facing off with Liberty as the 12th seed. So that would be the pod in Tampa in the South region with this bracket. The 1 seed in the region is Purdue. Now, here's why that's notable. Because a few days ago, John Rothstein reported that Houston will no longer be the host program for the South region in the 2026 NCAA tournament, which means the Houston Cougars can host Sweet 16 and Elite 8 games if they are to be the number 1 seed or a number 1 seed or a high seed, whatever that may be. And in Joe Lunardi's bracket right here, they are the number 1 overall seed. Houston is garnering a ton of hype this year. And of course, Auburn is going to play Houston in Birmingham early on in the season, and that's going to be such a big matchup for the Tigers as well as the Cougars, but especially for the Tigers with this brand new basketball team. And it'll be really interesting to see how this shakes out. That's not an official quite yet, but coming from John Rothstein, you can trust that report. That's likely to be the case. So that's a big deal. If you're Auburn, do you want to be in the South region? And potentially have to go to Houston to face Houston. Now, obviously, this past season, it wasn't much of a problem for the Tigers, but I think it's gonna be a different animal when you're facing the Cougars in a Sweet 16 or Elite 8 environment in their home city. So that is something to keep an eye on when that does become official and how that shakes out. So Auburn's path in this version of the bracketology, and we'll follow it for all intents and purposes, because Purdue is the 1 seed here and would face the winner of Missouri or Baylor in the second round before heading to Houston to face whoever comes out of the Louisville, Liberty, Auburn, High Point pod. Now, on the bottom half of the South region, you're looking at teams like Arizona, who Auburn will face in early December in Tucson. And then you've got Oregon, who Auburn will face in Las Vegas. A lot of rematches here. As well as SEC foes like Missouri and Vanderbilt are in the South region. And then there's Memphis as the 11th seed, the AQ. Auburn will face Memphis in the exhibition, so that's not technically a rematch, so to speak, that the NCAA Tournament Committee will factor in, but that is a team that Auburn would be familiar with due to the exhibition that we're going to talk about later on in this episode. But this is a very interesting region, in my opinion, just because it is quite a bit of your high major programs, not a ton of the mid majors in the higher seeds. Like I said, Purdue, Missouri, Baylor, the 1, 8, 9 seeds, Louisville, Auburn, the 5 and the 4, Ohio State, Arizona are the 6 and the 3, and then Oregon, St. John's are the 7 and 2 with Vanderbilt as the 10. So you're really facing some of the toughest competition in this South region. It would not be an easy region to reach the Final Four with. I don't think Purdue would love in this region, quite frankly, having to face a Louisville or Auburn in the Sweet 16, and then all the way down to it as St. John's or Arizona potentially in the Elite Eight if an Ohio State or an Oregon does not make a run from that side of the bracket, and obviously Auburn in the same boat. So you look at the rest of this bracket and all 68 teams that are involved, and the common theme for the last year has been how dominant the SEC has been. Joe Lunardi projecting another record number of SEC teams in the field with 14. That ties last year's record. And quite frankly, it'll be interesting to see these three teams and how they perform this season. Ole Miss and Georgia are part of the last 4 byes, means not playing in the first 4. Texas A&M under first-year head coach Bucky McMillan projected to be in the last 4 in the first 4, facing off with Miami. Those 3 teams are definitely the wild cards. I feel like if you tier out the SEC teams for the upcoming season, LSU and South Carolina are your 2 clear bottom teams. I don't believe Joe Lunardi has either of them in the field, but it's something to keep an eye out on. How do those teams fare? Can they potentially become that 15th team to make the field and break last year's record? We'll see. Nothing would shock me at this point. It also wouldn't shock me if Ole Miss or Georgia or Texas A&M falter a little bit and struggle and don't have their best on display for the season, and they might be edged out of the NCAA tournament altogether. So you look at some of the other SEC teams that are higher up in the seed rankings and whatnot. I mentioned Missouri and Vanderbilt in the South region with Auburn in this bracket as it stands right now. Again, way too early bracketology. That's the whole deal with this. When we get down to it in late February and early March, and we're taking a look at this, it'll be interesting to kind of go back and look at these. And I don't think many people do, but I would like to see the differences and the expectation changes, because again, I think that a lot of these expectations are pretty on point. I do think Purdue and Houston and Florida and Duke are going to be 4 of the best teams in the country and are strong contenders for 1 seeds, as Joe Lunardi points out here. I think Auburn is right there in the conversation for a top 16 national seed and being a top 4 seed. Could they inch up to be a 3 or a 2 maybe, or even repeat as a 1 seed? I don't know. We'll have to see as the season plays out, when Auburn does face the likes of Houston, of Purdue, of an Arizona, of Florida, and the rest of the SEC gauntlet. That's when we can see what Auburn's ceiling really is. And right now, I like where Auburn sits in this expectation-wise. But as I was saying, the rest of the SEC, when you look at the seed list, I wish there was just a straight seed list. It'd be a little bit easier to break down. But Florida, the defending national champions, is the 1 seed in the East. Again, the number 1 overall seed is Houston. If that report by John Ross seems to correct, then they would obviously be in the South region hosting the Sweet 16 and Elite 8. Not officially, but obviously they would be hosting in their home city. So Florida, the number 1 seed in the East region, the top SEC team in this bracket update. And then you have to go to the 3 seed, the 3 line, where Kentucky is your next SEC team on the docket alongside Tennessee. So Kentucky in the West, Tennessee in the Midwest as your 3 seeds from the SEC. Those are your top 3 SEC teams, according to Joe Lunardi right now. And then right behind that is obviously Auburn as a 4 seed, Arkansas as a 4 seed, and then Alabama as a 5 seed. Arkansas is in the East region. Alabama is in the Midwest. It would be traveling out to Portland for its first round game. And funny enough, matched up against Yale. How ironic is that? But we look at the kind of those top 6 teams. I think that these are the key for the SEC to keep the strength building and this dominant conversation going for the conference. And really it's the key for Auburn. And can you defend as an SEC champion? Can you get that top 4 seed in the SEC tournament if you don't defend as the SEC champion? Can you get this top 4 seed or even better? Yeah, the key is, how do you fare against these teams? Auburn's going to play Arkansas twice in John Calipari's second season, and Joe Lunardi has them as a 4 seed above Alabama. How do you fare against Alabama, who you always play twice? And then obviously you get Kentucky at home, Florida and Tennessee, you're going to have to go on the road. So again, are these teams as strong as many predict? I don't know, because, there's a lot of change in the SEC this year, a ton of turnover. Kentucky brings back Otega Oweh. That's a big deal. That's great and all, but you still see a lot of newcomers on that roster. You're still not just 100% sure how Florida's going to fare without Walter Clayton Jr., or Alabama without Mark Sears, or Tennessee. Things are changing in the SEC, and how does that translate to the regular season? And then obviously that relays into the NCAA tournament and where the seeding projects and whatnot. I just think that Auburn does have a chance to again really hit that ceiling of a potential Final Four team, but it's going to take some time for this team to gel. And practice is officially going to get started here in several weeks and whatnot, and we're going to get a sneak peek at them whenever they face off in those exhibitions. And I just think that when it really comes down to it, getting into the NCAA tournament as a top 16 seed is the way to go. Obviously, last year was one of those rare occurrences where those 4-1 seeds were dominant, and being Auburn, being Duke, being Houston, being Florida. So if you were picking games before the tournament, I think there were a lot that thought, okay, chalk, here it goes. Everyone talked about the experts on ESPN and CBS and wherever going full chalk. And sure enough, they were right. They knew what they were talking about. Those teams were the best teams in the country and really showed out in the month of March as well as April. Will it be the same next year? Probably not. That's the nature of this beast of a NCAA tournament. We talked about last time the inevitability of the tournament expanding. It's starting to look like that's not going to happen for next year. It's likely going to happen at some point, but I think we're still going to get one more year at least of a 68-team field before we expand to 72 or 76. So that's good to see at least. I'm just, again, just looking this up and down, it really does I think the SEC has another chance to really have a great year where it sets that record or ties that record. You look at the UConns and the Michigans that are seeded number 2 by Joe Lunardi. That's something very interesting. 2 teams that obviously Michigan was a Sweet 16 team that Auburn beat last year, have a brand new team as well. Auburn will face them in Las Vegas for the Players Era Festival. And then you got UConn, who took a big step back after back-to-back national champions, was an 8 seed in the NCAA tournament before falling in the second round last year. And now it's up to Dan Hurley to get the Huskies back to that prominence, and they can certainly do it. I really like where Auburn is set up here. I don't think any of these regions are necessarily cakewalks. I don't think, when I jump across to the West region, UCLA is the 4 seed and would face Utah Valley in the first round, but then we get Gonzaga as the 5 seed. That's not an easy matchup. And then if UCLA were to advance to the Sweet 16, probably be facing number 1 seed Duke. That's not a cakewalk. And then your Elite 8 matchup, you're looking at a Kansas, a Kentucky, maybe a BYU with AJ DeBanstead. Like, these are not easy matchups. The college basketball is looking to be a strong year next year. Lots of great freshmen. NIL, we talk about that and how it impacts the game. It's impacting it positively in the sense that a lot of good players that might have gone pro, might have gone overseas a little earlier on, they're staying in school to cash in on the NIL that they can. There's the numbers, and I don't have them off the top of my head or in front of me, but of how many players entered the NBA draft this year compared to years prior, and the number has gone down dramatically because they're staying in school and they want to capitalize on their NIL while they can, their name, image, and likeness. And there's no guarantee with professional basketball where you'll land, and they feel comfortable with riding out their scholarship, getting their education, and making what they can while they're in school. So that's where again, we've got to see these teams hit the floor before we really talk about them. And that's why this is a way too early projection, but it is a good sense of what the expectations are like for Auburn, for the SEC, for the rest of college basketball. Like I said, BYU is a 2 seed. AJ DeMasta right there as a freshman. UConn back up to a 2 seed. That would be great for the sport to see Dan Hurley and the Huskies back on top after their back-to-back national champions in 2023 and 2024. So, I think the SEC can certainly hit that mark they hit last year of 14 SEC teams in the field. Will they do it? I don't know. You're really banking on Bucky McMillan having a successful first year with the Aggies in College Station. You are banking on Ole Miss and Georgia under Chris Beard and Mike White to make that next jump, because I think at this point, both of those teams, both of those programs are at a point that it is time they make the jump and contend in the top half of the SEC. And if not, then will it ever happen? I don't know. And obviously those top 6 teams that we discussed earlier, Auburn, Florida, Kentucky, Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama. Those are the core teams for this conference that really keep it churning and have been doing so for the last 5 to 10 years in the league. So I'm really excited to see how things shake out and what we start to hear out of practices and workouts and everything that goes into that from around the league. What expectations kind of shift. Again, this is not the first bracketology that Lunardi has put out. I think he probably put one out the day after the national championship back in April. So there's movement. And NC State moved up to the 7 seed. That's movement with Will Wade's addition, as well as plenty of transfer portal additions. Ole Miss was moved up to the 10 seed. Wisconsin dropped to a 7 seed. So plenty of movement around just since that first bracket came out from Lunardi, and that will change obviously as the season approaches. And then after that first couple of weeks of games after Feast Week, we'll really see some movement and start to hone in our expectations and how we feel about these teams going into conference play when January rolls around. So the first bit of action we're going to see from these teams are in exhibitions, charity exhibitions, and Auburn will be a part of 2 of them, and probably 2 of the bigger exhibitions that the Tigers have played in really ever. Auburn faced FAU, Florida Atlantic, last year in Neville Arena. It was a charity exhibition benefiting Melton Scholars program on the Auburn campus, but both of these exhibitions that Auburn will participate in 2025 will be off campus in Birmingham and then Atlanta. So the first will obviously be the game against Oklahoma State. We've discussed it already. Ballin and Boutwell, part of a Nike exhibition series. So again, the Nike swoosh is already starting to benefit the Tigers and this program. And, getting into marquee exhibitions is, as silly as that sounds, that matters. Being able to put your talent on display like this and in a game there's less pressure on you. These guys want to be able to go out and really showcase their skill set. And this is a perfect opportunity to do that, as well as this team to gel. That's obviously the most important thing for this team. So Ballin and Boutwell will take place on October 15th at 7 p.m. Central in Boutwell Auditorium in Birmingham. So all of you Birmingham folks that, it's difficult to get to games down in Auburn and Neville Arena. It's also not going to be easy here because Boutwell Auditorium only seats about 4,000. It's a smaller venue, a very intimate venue. Tickets are on sale at ballininboutwell.com. That's a great chance to get an up close and personal look of the Tigers and first time sporting the swoosh for the basketball team. So we knew about that. Oklahoma State coming to Birmingham for that. But the news that we learned earlier this week was the game in Atlanta against Memphis. Memphis, we talked about a little bit. They're projected in the NCAA tournament field. Auburn faced Memphis in the Maui Invitational Championship this past year, won the final, in my opinion, real Maui that we're potentially going to see. That's a discussion for another day. If you look at the Maui field for this upcoming year, it's nowhere near what Auburn conquered this past year, where you're facing the likes of the back-to-back national champions in Connecticut, North Carolina Blue Blood. Michigan State was in that field. Iowa State was a top 5 team. Memphis is obviously a good basketball program. So, it's cool to see this rematch happen and get to see the Tigers face off in an exhibition. This will be on Thursday, October 30th at State Farm Arena at 7:30 Central. This game is also a part of a doubleheader with the women's matchup. South Carolina and North Carolina will face off at 5 Central in State Farm Arena. So kind of a cool night there. Obviously, seeing one of the best or two of the best women's programs face off for two of the best men's programs face off. Tickets will go through Ticketmaster on sale Thursday, August 8th at 9 a.m. Central. So you Atlanta folks, same deal with the Birmingham folks. There's your opportunity to see the Tigers. But that's not the only time Auburn will play in Atlanta. We're still anticipating that holiday Hoopsgiving matchup to come through. The non-conference schedule is not officially set for Auburn. We're still waiting on that to come through. And we obviously know a lot of the matchups like Houston and Birmingham. We know the Players Era Festival. We know about NC State and Neville Arena. We know about Arizona and Tucson. We know about Purdue and Indianapolis. So we've got the gist of it, but just waiting on some of those home matchups as well as that Hoopsgiving matchup to be finalized, and we'll be able to really break it down from there. But again, these exhibitions are more important than ever. They truly are for this program, for this team with 10 newcomers, bunch of freshmen. You've got an international guy, Filip Jovic, coming into the mold. You got the D2 transfer in Elijah Freeman. You've got the JUCO guys in Emeka Oporum and Abdul Bashir. And then you've got the high major transfers in Keyshawn Murphy, Keyshawn Hall, and then you got the one lone returnee in Tahaad Pettiford. So how do these guys gel together? You can find out earlier than everyone else by attending those games. And again, it's really cool that Auburn's getting to face a high major program team like Oklahoma State, and then one of the stronger mid-majors in the nation in Memphis. Again, and this is, nothing against Florida Atlantic, but Florida Atlantic is a weaker opponent, regardless of the Final Four appearance it had just a few years ago. And obviously, the exhibitions of facing D2 colleagues might be over. I think these are the direction the sport is going. This is much more valuable for a team. This is not just valuable as far as money is concerned, but it does really help this team gel and grow together before the season really gets started. And then you're just playing high-level basketball in November versus really figuring things out then. So really excited for both of those exhibitions, and we'll cover it all here on the Barn Hoops podcast. And obviously, it's game month for Auburn football. It's August 1st, and fall camp is underway. There's plenty going on right here on the Barn Auburn Podcast Network. We've got everything covered. I'll keep covering the hoops, obviously, leading up to the season coming up. But Village Vice with Brad Law and Zach Blackerby, as well as the Top Button Podcast with Kyle Rush, a.k.a. Charlie 5. We'll cover all the football happenings leading up to August 29th against Baylor, that Friday night season opener. Man, can't wait to be in Waco. It's going to be a blast with the Auburn Tigers football team this year, and really hoping that the Tigers can take that next leap and really contend in the SEC and maybe for a playoff spot in the 2025 season. But that's going to do it for this edition of the Barn Hoops podcast. Let me know what you think about Joe Lunardi's way too early bracketology projection. Is a 4 seed about right for this team? I think it is, being with 10 newcomers. I think I quite frankly, I think that shows the respect someone like Joe Lunardi has for this program, that the Tigers can bring in 10 new guys. And he says, well, yeah, they'll still finish in the top 16 overall this season and be a top 4 seed and get to play kind of in their same region in the South. So that's a big deal for Auburn to have those kinds of expectations going into the year. But let me know if you think they should be higher, maybe lower. If you want to see, obviously, we want to see them play games before we really get into these projections. But based off what you know, what do you think? And obviously, we'll cover more and more as things go on. Classes are going to be in session coming up on August 18th at Auburn. So that's when news will probably start to really drop, and we'll start to really kick gears up. No show next week. I will be out of town on vacation. So we will talk in 2 weeks whenever hopefully there's more news, maybe a non-conference schedule to talk about. At some point, the SEC schedule is going to come out as well, and we can really break it down. So excited for it. Thanks for tuning in to this edition of the Barn Hoops Podcast.